Welcome back to the MHS Pawdcast. I am Sydney Gordesky, joined by my co-host, Jakob Krombholz. Today we are joined by Elie Honig. Mr. Honig is a CNN Senior Legal Analyst and Executive Director at the Rutgers Institute for Secure Communities and a national best-selling author of Hatchet Man and Untouchable. He previously worked as a federal and state prosecutor, including 8 years as an assistant attorney general for the Southern District of New York.
Like you see in the movies, right? It wasn't all glamour and courtroom drama. I got to see how much hard work went into it. And so when I went to public schools like this, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, but K through 12, all public. I went to Rutgers University, not putting in a plug here, but excellent public school. And then it was while I was at Rutgers that I realized I wanted to go into law. When I left high school, I thought I wanted to be a psych major. I wanted to do psychology. But then this will happen probably to you guys, for better or for worse. I got to Rutgers. I had a really boring psych class and a really interesting poli-sci class. And maybe my sophomore year, I did an internship with the Middlesex County. Here we're in Middlesex County, so Middlesex County Public Defender's Office. And I got to work with, go into the jail and meet with clients, watch trials, and I thought, this is it. And I had one specific professor at Rutgers, who I'm still close with to this day, who just inspired me. And you guys, maybe you have that here or you'll find that. But then I sort of knew, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to go to law school. And I went right from Rutgers to Harvard Law School. And then I guess I didn't answer your question. You said prosecutor. I knew when I graduated Harvard that I wanted to become a prosecutor eventually. It's hard to do right out of law school, so I went and worked for a DC law firm for 3.5 years, and then I got the job as a prosecutor, which I did for the next 14 years.
Awesome. I was curious, you talk about this a little bit in your book, like the glamour that was not to be found as a federal prosecutor. You talk about like the food trucks, kind of thing. What inspired you to go into that kind of work, even though you knew, there was something else to be found elsewhere?
There's a trade-off, right? In the world of law and probably in a lot of other fields. You can always just pursue money, right? In the law world, you can go work for a law firm and make just huge amounts of money. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. Law firms are great. I'm part of a law firm now as we speak, in addition to all the other things. But if you choose to go into public service, you will not make as much money. I talk in the book about eating our lunches when I say food trucks, you guys probably think of these high-end food trucks. This is like the old days when food trucks was just like grilled cheese and, burgers and stuff. And I do joke in the book about how cruddy our offices were, how we had bed bugs and dead mice. This is in New York City. But it pays off a lot in other ways. It's so satisfying. You're doing work that's so important. So interesting and fun. I tell stories throughout both books about real life trials I did. And some of this stuff is like, people ask me, because I did Mafia cases. I was a prosecutor of Mafia. And people sometimes say, well, is it like the movies? Is it like Sopranos and Godfather and Goodfellas? I say, it's better. It's real.
Yeah.
So there's a trade-off. And you guys will consider these things as you move through life. But, to me, not everything's about money's great, but not everything's about money. And having a job that's satisfying and challenging is the greatest thing.
What do you think, based on the lawyers that you've seen in your career, wherever you've met them, what characteristics make up a really great lawyer?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I think there's a little bit of a misperception that lawyers are like the kid who always wants to argue in class, right? You had, if you know my son, which you do, right? People say, although he's probably headed that way, but it's not always necessarily the argumentative type. You want someone who's going to be, first of all, you just have to have a work ethic. Like you can't halfway that job, but someone who's going to be analytical, someone who can look at a problem and say, okay, here's how we're going to get through this. Here's the strengths of where I'm at. Here's the weaknesses of where I'm at. Here's what the other guy's going to say. We always used to say, well, okay, that's a great point. What's the other guy going to say? There's always going to be a smart person on the other side of the table. You have to be a good writer. I'll put in a pitch for your English teachers here. So much of what you do in the law is writing. And I mean both the actual briefs that you write, but even when you're getting ready to address a jury, you don't script it out. You don't necessarily write. Some people do, but I never wrote out like every word. But you want to structure it. Think about, how do I want to present? And the same goes for media, which I'm sure we'll get into. What are the main ideas I want to convey? In what order? How can I convey this most powerfully? So writing is overlooked a lot of times, I think. Writing is the single most important skill you can have in being a lawyer.
Interesting. In your book, Hatchet Man, you wrote that as a lawyer, speaking of the values of a lawyer, nothing comes easy. You have to earn your stripes as a prosecutor, and book learning doesn't cut it. What was one lesson you learned in the courtroom that the classroom didn't teach you?
Oh, that's a good one. There are so many important lessons, and I'm glad you seized on that, because I talk in the book about there's the written rules and then there's the unwritten rules. It's
Right.
the same thing. I know you're an athlete, baseball player. I'm sure what kind of activities you do this?
Media, yeah.
Yeah, but any field, any industry has its written rules, right? Baseball, 3 outs, and all that. But there's unwritten rules in baseball, right? Like you can't step on the line, right?
Yes.
Or you don't walk on the pitcher's mound if you're not the pitcher. And so it's the same thing with being a prosecutor. I mean, I wrote that in the context of criticizing Bill Barr, who was Attorney General a few years ago. One of the rules that I talk about, and this applies probably to things that you both do, is you don't sell out, you don't undercut your teammates, right? Not publicly, right? And so I tell stories about times when we had disagreements or I had a disagreement, and you would go back and you would talk about in the clubhouse, so to speak, back at the office, you work it out. What you don't do, and what I criticize Bill Barr for doing, is publicly going out and undercutting his own prosecutors and embarrassing them, humiliating them, and undoing their work.
Right.
So what were some of the challenges you faced as a lawyer early on?
Let's think. So, well, when you start out at a firm, you go through this transition, right? Because you're coming out of law school and you're sort of like, wow, this is, you have this idealistic version of what the law is. And now you're about to be an adult for the first time and enter the real world. If you start out at a law firm, which a lot of people do, you're the low person. I mean, you are getting the bottom level work. You are getting what we call discovery, which is where you just spend all day going through documents. You're not in court. You're not arguing big motions. And there are definitely times when you think, this is what I did this for. This is why I went to 4 years of college, 3 years of law school, like, so I could go through this cruddy box of old, moldy documents. But you have to put in, like anything else, you don't just start at the top. You have to work your way up. You have to prove yourself. So I think that's a big difficulty that you have to deal with immediately. As a prosecutor, it's great because then you become a real lawyer. You're in court, you're arguing cases, you're doing trials, you're meeting with FBI agents who you're working with, all this. But then you have to get it, for me at least, it was getting into home life balance, right? It's hard. I mean, your parents work, both of you, and it's a lot to raise young kids while you're trying to do a serious career. So it's not easy to find that balance.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Honig, you're a graduate of Harvard Law School. I'm sure you had many career options, and you talked about working for some firms early on. How'd you end up in the Southern District of New York?
So I will tell you this, there's a lesson to this story, which is that failure and rejection are always going to be part of whatever you do in any field. I had my heart set on becoming a prosecutor. I had been at this firm, for 3 years or so, and it was about time where I had enough experience where I could start to get in as a prosecutor. I applied I'm from South Jersey, so I applied to the Philadelphia U.S. Attorney, which is the federal prosecutor there, got rejected. I applied to the Brooklyn U.S. Attorney, got rejected. I applied to the Southern District and got in. And the Southern District, I think most people will tell you, is the most prestigious U.S. Attorney's office in the country. Part of that is just sort of happenstance and luck. Maybe the other offices didn't have openings. Maybe the Southern District did. I just kind of hit it off with the U.S. Attorney who I was interviewing with. But you have to sort of apply far and wide. You have to be ready for rejection, and you have to be ready for, okay, fine, what am I doing next?
What were some of your most memorable moments from the courtroom or the clubhouse in the Southern District of New York?
I tried a lot of cases. I mean, I had a lot of moments where it's like, wow, like this is a murder case. Like someone was killed, and I'm trying to convict the guy who did it. One of the things I did a lot of was what we call cooperating witnesses, where you have someone who was involved in crimes who has said, okay, I'm going to plead guilty, I'm going to testify, and they hope to and do get a big sentencing reduction. So I had moments where I had to put on somebody who was part of a murder to say, yes, it was me and this defendant, this defendant, this defendant, and we did that all together. So I had moments of that. I had moments where I was not physically, but I was verbally attacked by family members and, threats. It's real life drama. I mean, it's one of the best things about being a prosecutor is there's a real human drama to it. And you see people at their best, you see people at their worst. So, but the thing about being in the courtroom is you have to improvise a lot of times. Unexpected things happen. And you have a jury here watching you, you have a judge sort of presiding over it, you have smart lawyers on the other side looking to attack you. So you have to be ready to sort of react to things on their feet. And you also realize the real world is not the classroom, right? Like there's things that happen sometimes in the courtroom that like, if you were in evidence class in law school, you go, well, that's not technically proper, but it's like, yeah, but I'm not going to stand up in front of the jury and make a fuss and tick off the judge and look like I'm afraid in front of the jury, right? So you have to sort of, okay, fine. It's not what the textbook says, but we're in real life now.
I'm curious, with those people who you said, I mean, I'm sure tensions were really high with some of these people in very intense situations. How do you not let that get to you, not take it personally?
Yeah.
You know, obviously you're a person and things like that would affect you.
Yeah, you do have to, you learn to separate yourself. You know, you have to do hard things. You have to send people to prison for, I mean, I've done sentencings where there's kids in the room crying because their father is getting sentenced to 15 years or something like that. There's a balance to be struck where you have to be able to separate yourself and, you know, not make anything. It's never personal. I never made it a battle between me and the defendant. It was always, this is a business. This is, you know, I'm doing my job. But you also do have to sort of retain your humanity. You can't, when you're a prosecutor, you have, I talk about this in the books, you have astonishing power. You can ruin lives. You can send people to prison. You can separate families. You can destroy careers, reputations. And so you have to use that power very carefully, and you have to be cognizant. And there's times when mercy and a little bit of leniency is appropriate. And so, but you have, as you go through the years, you get better at judging which cases are worthy of really going after and which cases maybe the person deserves a little bit of a break.
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned you worked in some mob and mafia cases.
Yeah.
So around the country, and especially here in New Jersey, mob bosses are depicted as sort of folk heroes.
Yeah.
Especially in pop culture.
Yes.
Can you explain the true effects of organized crime here in our region?
That's a great question. Most of what I did was centered in New York and Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, but some of it certainly spilled over to, we had cases in New Jersey. I had cases with, I guess I won't get too graphic, but with serious things that happened here in New Jersey. Yeah, the movies definitely over glamorized this. I mean, you know, you think of The Godfather, you guys are too young, but like Marlon Brando, Sopranos, James Gandolfini, like they're portrayed as these powerful guys who live these like wild lives of, you know, with money and power and all this. I mean, real mob bosses, some are a little bit like that, but really being a mobster is a miserable existence. And this is what I always say, The Sopranos, don't watch it. It's not appropriate for your age, but The Sopranos gets this right, that it's a grind. It is a world filled with jealousy, betrayal, stress. I mean, when these guys cooperate, I would spend a lot of time with them. And one of them once said to me, when you get killed, the last person you're going to see is your best friend. Hold it, you know. So that's what that world is really like.
Thank you. That's kind of a little bit different, but I thought it was
that's a good question.
So you mentioned earlier, you're one of your professors in it. Who was another role model / mentor that kind of shaped your career?
Well, so, you know, I've always, and I would, you know, you will find role models wherever you go, whether it's here or college and beyond. I had this one professor, Milt Human, who I'm still close with. Like I said, I'm going to his holiday party in a couple days. I had a lot of great teachers. Obviously, my parents. I mean, it all starts with the parents, not to be hokey, but that's definitely true in my case. Who set a good example of just work ethic and a supportive family. And then wherever I went in my career, when I went to the law firm, I found some partners, older men and women who had been experienced at this, who I connected with personally, who I worked with. When I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office, there was one person in particular who was my unit chief and sort of took care of me. I mean, a lot of people do that. You know, a lot of people looked out for me. Even now at CNN, there's people who make sure to take care of me and make sure that, you know, I'm doing well and are there if I have any questions. So that's a really important thing that you'll find as you go through your schooling and then your jobs.
Right. I was gonna, you know, ask here, your first boss at the Southern District of New York office seemed like he really helped you. Do you have any stories of like the lessons that he taught you?
Dave Kelly?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Dave Kelly was sort of the guy who hired me. I saw him the other day. I'm always like a little intimidated by him. He sort of was the one who taught us, and when I say us, it's, you kind of come in with a class, almost like a freshman class. I mean, not all at the same time. He taught us a lot of the lessons that I talk about in the book, that the need to do the right thing, even if it's painful, the need to be loyal to one another, the need to always tell the full truth to the court, to the judge. A lot of that came from him, not just him though, but I mean, Others, Preet Bharara was another boss of mine. Mimi Rocca was who I was referencing before. It's, again, to make like a sports analogy, it's like, rookies watch the best veterans and try to learn from what does that person do, and how did that person become successful, and how does that person sort of maintain excellence. So try to do that.
How do you think that these mentors, how have they affected your both legal and journalistic careers?
By setting an example. Sometimes it's by way of specific advice.
Right.
Okay, don't do this, or make sure you do that. Sometimes it's just more powerfully, I think, just by watching them. I mean, some of the people who, sometimes it's just by setting a good example. Different people lead in different ways. Some people are very verbal, vocal. Some people are just, sort of quiet, and you go, oh, I like what that person's doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
So, as we've mentioned throughout the episode, you're the author of 2 best-selling books. Did you envision yourself as an author?
I didn't envision any. Let me just be clear. Like, from the time, so I've been doing media for the last 5 and change years. None of that was planned. None of that. I mean, this all just happened by the way the wind blows. What happened was I had been a prosecutor for 14 years. I knew it was time to move on. But I didn't want to go into the big firm life. And so I took a job teaching at Rutgers, which you mentioned before, Jacob. And then it just so happened it was the summer of 2018 when there was Trump investigation news on the headlines every day. And friends of mine, including who I mentioned before, people who I had worked with the Southern District of New York, had started doing TV work. And so they asked me, would you want to try this? And I said, yeah, sure. It sounds fun. I think it would be good for what I'm doing with Rutgers, right? It sort of can help promote Rutgers' image. And I started doing it, and I was okay at it for a beginner, and I liked it, and I enjoyed the challenge of it. And it's just, now I'm going into my 5th, 6th year with CNN. So that was not planned. In the course of doing that, the books happened. And the way it happened was very unusual, because usually the way you get a book deal is you get an agent, like a book agent, and then they try to help you craft an idea, and then they shop it around to the publishers. I actually, again, an example of something not working the first time. I had a book agent, and she put some of my ideas out there. We got a couple nibbles, but nothing landed. 2 years or so later, during the beginning of COVID, I remember I was sitting on my back deck, and there was a DM, direct message. You guys know a DM on Twitter, and I get you get a lot of strange DMs when you're on TV. People, have sometimes like you and sometimes don't. And it just was I know it was 17 words. I quote it in the acknowledgments of my book, but it basically said, hey, see you on TV. Would you be interested in writing a book about Bill Barr and the Justice Department? And he wrote, P.S. I'm an editor, not an agent. And I looked him up, and basically it was like, he's from HarperCollins. There's 3 big publishers in the United States. HarperCollins, one of it, Eric Nelson. And I realized who he was, and I called him. I said, yes, let's talk. And 2 days later, we had a deal. And a year later, we had a book. And a year later, we had another book, basically. But I found a good person, and he lets me do what I want. I joked at one of my book events. I said, Eric did the best thing that any editor can do. Nothing. That's not quite true, but he helped me sort of shape a little bit what I wanted to say, but he's very hands-off, and all he ever encouraged me to do is like, tell it straight, come with a strong, well-justified position, and you're good to go. He never tried to say, ooh, maybe scale this back or tone this up. Same with CNN, by the way. People sometimes say, oh, does CNN ever tell you what to say? Do they ever? Zero. Never happened. Sometimes people go, oh, that was really good, but they never go, try to push it a little this way, or absolutely never. They want your truthful, honest, well-supported view.
And a lot of times the news is so, it's happening so rapidly that you might not even have time to meet about it, or this is what you should say.
You're so right. I mean, yesterday is a perfect example. So yesterday, Donald Trump was supposed to testify in his civil case that's going on. So I was ready. I was going to go all day. We had people at the courtroom. We had people in the studio. And then the night before Sunday night, it was announced he's not testifying. And all of a sudden, all that fell apart. And then we had a couple little minor things. And I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe I'll go home. And then like 4 new stories dropped in the next 2 hours and right back on. So you do have to be ready to adjust very quickly. Either way, sometimes you think you're going to have a quiet day and all heck breaks loose. And sometimes you think you're going to have a major day and nope, something else happened in the world. And everything's wiped out.
Speaking of your books, in Hatchet Man, you said that as a lawyer, you always do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And I know you mentioned that one of your bosses really encourage that too. But how have you managed to balance your personal opinions and
Yep.
feelings, and you're a father and a husband, while staying true to the Constitution and your professional obligation?
That's a good question. So that's a quote from Preet Bharara, one of my other bosses. And one of the great things about being a prosecutor, we used to say the cliches are all true, right? And that's one example of that. You know, you have to bring your personal experience, your judgment into things as a prosecutor. You can't, I sometimes say we're not robots. It's not just, well, this happened, that's a crime, therefore we charge, therefore we seek the maximum sentence. Like there's this image of prosecutors, like I just want to lock everyone up for the longest possible. That's not what a good prosecutor does. This is how I teach my students at Rutgers. I just taught them earlier today. You have to bring your judgment, your discretion into play. But again, you also have to maintain that professional distancing. You can't turn it into an obsession. I've seen colleagues of mine become like so bitter towards certain defendants, right? They make it personal. They hate this guy, and you can't let that happen.
So we've mentioned all these sort of aspects of your life.
Yeah.
You started as a prosecutor. You've now worked, and you were mentioning it before, at CNN. How is being a legal analyst differed from actually practicing law?
It's similar and different, and I'll give you both of those. It's similar in that the bottom line goal is basically the same, which is to take this mass, sometimes complicated mass of facts and complicated legal ideas and concepts and boil them down into a form where normal people can understand and agree with you, right? And as a lawyer, that's what you do with a jury, right? You'll have cases, you'll have 1,000 boxes of documents. Well, you're not going to, you don't have that much time to try your case. How do I boil this down to something they'll understand with a 1-hour jury address? In TV, it's kind of the same thing, but like, how do I boil this down to 4 minutes and a half, 4 minutes and 30 seconds? So those skills transfer. You have to be nimble in both of them. Like I said, you have to be ready to respond to whatever comes up. Both jobs take for every 1 minute you see on TV, if you count up everybody, hours and hours of work went into that 1 minute. And the same thing for lawyers, right? Like for every minute in the courtroom, you've spent hours and hours preparing. But I mean, if we say for TV, you take your average 5-minute segment, right? Sometimes you'll have a day where you're there all day, but you're only on air. If you actually count up the minutes you're on air, maybe you're on air for 40 minutes, but you're there for 8 hours. But so much work goes into it. There's my preparation, and there's all the producers, there's the lighting people, there's all, the sound folks, the makeup people. I mean, so much work goes into every minute. And so the public, or in the case of a lawyer, the jury or the judge will only see a small portion of that, but you have to work so hard. I mean, again, like to make an athletic analogy, you practice how many hours for every minute of a game. You know what I mean, right? All that work, all that training, all that, lifting and practice, and then your game happens and it's 40 minutes or whatever, right? So, yeah. I relate to the world a lot through sports. I don't do them that much on air. I only do it if I'm certain that people are going to really get it. If it's like really obvious. Like, will my mom understand? That's my test.
So sports always help in conversation. Just using this analogy.
Well, sometimes it's the perfect, and sometimes it hits right on.
I was wondering too, like, how do you, obviously you and I'm sure your colleagues have gone through years and years of some of the best legal education that you can get out there. How do you explain this to the viewer at home who maybe studied something else that was not law, or is not well versed in this, or doesn't spend their whole day looking at this?
So that's a great question. And we in the media always have this habit of like assuming the viewers know too much. Like, we live in this stuff. We live in the weeds of this. I could right now just tick off, here's all the Trump trials. I probably have to think about it. But like, you can't expect the average viewer to just like live this. And so it's always a good idea to like step back for a second, right? Like, what does this mean? Where are we big picture? A lot of times I'll use graphics. Like, if you've ever seen the segments I do in the morning with the magic wall behind me, and I can create those, I plan them the night before. I say, give me an image of this. And the visuals really help drive it home. But I'll give you an example. There's an issue right now where Trump is trying to get one of the cases against him thrown out on something called immunity. And we were immediately off to the races and explaining it. This morning I started off my segment. I said, let's just start with, what is immunity? What does it mean? And I actually use an example from when I was a prosecutor that people really resonate with. So the more you can make something understandable and relatable, The other little tactic that I've given, and it doesn't really apply to this kind of interview, but when you're on air and you're asked a question, one idea per answer, not one sentence per answer, but like sometimes your idea will be, okay, yes, this is going to happen for 3 reasons. But you don't want to just like meander into an answer and hope it goes somewhere, right?
Yeah.
You don't plan out what you're going to say. You definitely don't script it. I've never read off a teleprompter. That's not my role. But you also, it's a mistake. I've seen people go like, I'll just wing it. And then they get in there and they kind of have nothing and they're kind of repetitive and they're kind of ambling long, right? So the couple things I do on air, I do that. I do one idea per answer and I'm concise. If you watch me on air, like my answers are tight. And if you put a clock on it, it's reliable. And I know viewers, anchors, everybody, nobody wants someone who just goes on and on and on.
Yeah. Jacob, do you have anything else?
So what would a typical day, so you've talked about, and again, all these different things. You talked about all the prep that goes into going into an episode. What does a typical day look like at CNN?
So there is no typical day, right? It could be mayhem, it could be total calm. But I'll give you yesterday, for example. How about that? Okay. So I had an event in New York City Sunday night, so I stayed, they put me in a hotel. I got up at 4:30. I went in, I did 2 segments on the morning show. One of them was like a magic wall with the graphics and stuff. Then I had a little bit of a break. So I had grabbed lunch, like they have a little nap room. So I took a little nap. They have a gym also. So I worked out and, showered and changed and everything. I brought a change of clothes. Then I did a segment for CNN International. We have our feed that you would see here in the United States. We have another feed that goes, although they both go international, but one is focused on international. And when you do that, you have to like take things out a level of generality because people watching in Belgium wouldn't necessarily understand our legal system. So you have to say something like, in our legal system, we have judges, we have juries.
Right.
Then I had a little bit of a break. I did a radio segment in between that for Sirius XM. Then I did a show at 4 p.m. Then I did a show at 8 p.m. And then I got home at like 9 or 9:30. So that's, it's like, there's definitely downtime. And then there's like, oh my God, this just happened. And a big story broke just before the 4 o'clock show. We were ready to start. We knew what our topics were going to be. And then I saw this story come across and I texted the producers. I said, I assume we're shifting to this. And they were like, yes, are you good to go? So, and they'll ask you a lot of times, like, one of the things I've been able to do is always be ready when stuff breaks, when there's new news. And I can react very quickly. But you have to, this is a really important media lesson. Make sure you see it for yourself, even if just for a minute. Like one time, I mean, I've made mistakes on there. We all have. Been doing this for 5 years. But like I made a pretty decent sized mistake when a big decision came down and a producer for the show that was on called me and said, oh my God, this just happened. Can you hop on? And I said, yes. What was the basis of the decision? And she pulled up the Washington Post. She said, I won't get into it. She said, it's A. I said, okay, got it. And I went on air and started talking about how the basis for the decision was A. And then I realized, I finished my first answer and I see text and I realized, oh, she got it wrong. It was actually B. And I was like, so my next go around, a minute later, I said, I actually misspoke earlier. I'm looking at it now. I realize it's not A, it's B. But now when a decision comes down or something, I will always go send it to me. And sometimes they'll go, can we come to you? I'll go, no, I need 90 seconds.
Right.
And I'll just go, boom, got it. Okay, now I'm ready. So like verify it for yourself. And people have made mistakes on air, but you want to be first, but it's way more important to be right.
Yeah. I've always been curious, just you talk about being on air, about those nights, whether, I know sometimes the way that CNN does it, whether it's election nights, this is a huge thing, or debates or other big nights where you're all at that panel.
Yeah.
Like, it just seems so, you never know what the person on the debate stage or the the next state that's going to come in. How do you do that kind of spontaneous thing?
We have producers, we have control rooms who are great at this, and they will guide traffic, and the anchors will sort of, okay, let's go over to you, let's go to him. But you have your laptop up, you're refreshing. Like I've done this for impeachments, I've done this for trials, for indictments, that kind of thing. I did, live trials, right? Like as they're happening, and then they come to you. It's like calling a football game, like Tony Romo does. Like what's happening now? What's going to happen next? And you get into a flow. Again, the anchors are really good at this. Like if you see me on those big panels, usually I'm with Anderson Cooper, is sort of, guiding traffic. And what makes him so good at that is if you watch a panel I'm on with Anderson, with let's say 4 other people, let's say it's me, 1 other lawyer, and then 2 political people, he wants us to make the big points. He doesn't see a need for himself to be, even though he's sitting in the middle, he doesn't see a need for himself to be front and center. He sees his job there is to ask the questions that normal viewers are thinking and then set us up to explain to the viewers. That's what makes him, I mean, he has a lot of great qualities, but that's one of the things that makes him really good at that job.
What is one piece of advice if someone's in our shoes?
Yeah.
We would love to have a career in media. We'd love to have a career into law. We'd love to be writers. What are some pieces of advice you would give to someone looking to do that?
This is not linear. Everything is not a straight line, right? I know probably people your age. I know my Rutgers students, they like have it all planned out in their mind. Like, okay, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to major in this. And then I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to work in this area. And then I'm going to go to law school at one of these 5 schools. And then, and then it's like, right. And your generation has way more pressure and just expectations than mine did. And probably mine more than the one before that. But it will never go according to a straight line. You will have setbacks that caught you by surprise. I talked to you about some of mine. You have opportunities. I talked to you about some of mine. I didn't know. I never thought about CNN. I never thought about being in media. I mean, it's still bizarre to me now that I'm part of the media because when you're a prosecutor, you almost see the media as like enemies or, but it's not linear. And people use the phrase like, what's your career path? I sometimes say it's not really a path. It's more like a winding road and it's really poorly lit and the signs don't make any sense. But, you adjust. You have to be resilient and, you have to move through failures or disappointments. And sometimes you'll see an opportunity that you never expected. Wow, my gosh, I'll do this. So, yeah.
I'm curious about your writing process. What, I assume this was one of the kind of unexpected career turns. Maybe you didn't see yourself doing this fresh out of college. What is your writing process like? You have an idea and then what happens?
So, and I write a weekly newsletter that turns into a podcast as well. The best writing sounds like conversation, right? The best writing doesn't sound like I am hereby writing. The best writing, if you listen to my Friday podcast, people who know me say it sounds like I'm just talking to you, right? Even if it's like not grammatically correct or you put in a joke or whatever. So it takes a while before you feel like you can write in your own voice, so to speak. My process, I don't know what the word is. There's got to be some phrase for this. I like put it all out on the page, just whatever comes on, and then I craft it, right? Like it's like if I could just like grab a huge lump of clay, slap it on the table, and then okay, let me pull this, let me pull that, let me, it's
that's
like,
interesting. You don't edit as you go. You just put everything there.
Well, I start with the big mass of thoughts, and then I edit like relentlessly. So my book, every page there, has been edited in some form or another 20 times over. Like I'm not, there'll be a day where I'll go, okay, I'm through chapter 10 right now. I'm going to spend the next 10 days, I'm going to edit each of the first 10 chapters, but I'm also going to start sort of, throwing ideas up there for the next 5 chapters. So to me, it's always like, get the ideas out and you can cut what doesn't work. Like one of the things my editor said to me, which was great advice, he said, the parts of the book that are most fun for you to write are going to be the best parts of the book. The parts of the book for you that feel like homework to write are going to be lousy, are going to drag. So that's sort of my approach to writing. Another thing is like when I did the audiobook, they give you a director and the director said, it's always best when you're telling the story, not reading the book, right? So it's like, again, you want to write in that sort of natural way. And, you learn to be fair. I mean, when you're in the media, when you're writing, people's reputation, you're talking about people. You're talking about, I criticize people. This guy did a horrible job. This guy made a mistake. But you also learn to be fair. You learn, well, what's that? What goes back to being a lawyer? What's the other guy going to say? What's his explanation going to be? You ask him sometimes. So yeah, that's my process basically.
I'm curious with books. I don't know if you can say anything, but can we expect any more Elie Honig books?
Yeah, I'd like to do a third one. I don't have I'm playing with a couple topics in my head, but like doing a book is such a massive investment of time and effort. Like you better be sure, first of all, the company, the publisher will tell you whether they want it or not. Like I had some good ideas and HarperCollins, my publisher, Eric, who I mentioned before, was like, good idea, but like that's not going to sell. Like I like it, it's interesting, but like no one's going to buy that. He's like a candid guy. Yeah, I'd like to do another one, but again, it's got to be like a topic that I really want to do and that we'll have. I think I have the beginnings of an idea.
Okay, interesting. Jacob, do you have anything?
So you're a huge Philly sports fan.
True.
Do you have any outlooks on the rest of the season for the Eagles?
Eagles. Well, we're all very depressed right now because we've gotten crushed the last 2 games. But I still think that we've got. I like what the team has. I think we have. This is like a lot of our veterans, maybe last shot. I think we're. I'm optimistic. I'll just say I'm optimistic probably unduly optimistic heading into the playoffs. Philly, same thing. I feel like we'll be in contention for a championship. I can't say the Sixers. I don't follow close enough to really have an opinion. Who's your team?
Devils. I'm a Devils fan.
Devils. Who's your
I'm a Yankees fan.
Oh yeah,
big Yankees fan.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah.
My dad's a Cowboys fan, but
Oh,
I don't really participate. So, lastly, on a much different note, we just wanted to get your reflections on the legacy of Sandra Day O'Connor. In more current news.
Yeah, good question. I mean, of course, you know that she was the first female U.S. Supreme Court justice. What I think is interesting about her beyond that, I mean, now we have 4 of the 9 are women, and someday we will probably have a majority. I work with a group I mentioned before, Mimi Rocco, who's my supervisor. She was part of a group that's of Southern District where I work, the Federal Prosecutor's Office alums that started a nonprofit called When There Are 9, meaning when there are 9 female justices. But more beyond that, Sandra Day O'Connor is sort of a throwback in that she was a legitimate center of the court. You didn't know she was appointed by Ronald Reagan, a Republican, but she didn't always go automatically one way or the other. And we lack that now, right? If you look at our Supreme Court now, it's all too predictable. I mean, I've been on air on Supreme Court days, and you just know exactly which cases are going to come down, what the vote's going to be, and who's going to be on which side. The liberals are always over on their side. The conservatives, there's the middle. There almost is no middle anymore. But she was a legitimate middle who could bring the different factions together. I think that's a big part of her legacy.
For sure.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yes,
it's been a pleasure.
Much.